Welcome back, everyone, to Daily Gossip. Now, I know the name of this show. Usually, when you tune in, we are breaking down the latest tech billionaire feuds, the political theater in Westminster or Washington, or the corporate drama shaking up Wall Street. But today, we are taking a detour. Today, we are looking at a whisper, a rumor that is growing louder by the day, not in the halls of Hollywood or the boardrooms of London, but across the vast, heavily guarded expanses of the Chinese mainland. Before we pull back the curtain on what might be the most consequential story of our lifetime, I want to ask a quick favor. If you appreciate these deep dives, if you want to understand the forces actually shaping the world your children are going to inherit, please hit that subscribe button. Leave a like, drop a comment, and make sure your notifications are on. The algorithm can be a fickle beast, and your support is literally what keeps this channel alive, allowing us to bring you the stories that the mainstream 24-hour news cycle simply doesn't in oppose. Have the patience to unpack. All right, pour yourself a coffee, or maybe something stronger. Settle in, because what we need to talk about today is heavy. I want you to visualize a map of China. Dawn and oppose. Just picture the neat, color-coded borders you see on Google Earth. Imagine stretching that map out across a massive table. Now, zoom in on the eastern provinces, the industrial heartlands, the agricultural basins. If you look closely at the data coming out right now, the satellite imagery, the thermal tracking, the economic indicators, you will see something that simply should not be possible in a country this powerful, this meticulously controlled, and this utterly obsessed with projecting an image of unbreakable strength to the rest of the world. Something is spreading, and it is not spreading slowly. It ISN and oppose. Moving quietly either, not in the way that problems usually navigate through massive bureaucratic systems that have been engineered for decades specifically to contain them. It is spreading fast. It is wider than the government ever anticipated, and it cuts far deeper than any official press conference or state media statement will ever admit. And here is the most chilling part. The people caught right in the middle of it? They are in and oppose. Talking to journalists. They are in and oppose. Posting on social media, because in many cases, those digital platforms have already been scrubbed, sanitized, and forced into a terrifying quiet. What you are about to hear today is not a prediction. I am not sitting here spinning a dystopian theory or indulging in doom scrolling. What we are looking at is a sequence of events that is already in motion. The dominoes are falling, and the further you follow this chain reaction, the more you will understand exactly why some of the sharpest geopolitical and financial analysts in the world, from London to New York to Frankfurt, are using one specific word to describe what is happening inside China right now. That word is, and quote, cascading, and quote. Think about what a cascade really means. When things cascade in a system as incomprehensibly massive and as tightly wound as China, the consequences do not politely stop at the border. They don't just stay in Beijing or Shanghai. They travel. They travel through the supply chains that stock the shelves at your local Target or Carrefour. They travel through the financial markets that hold your pension funds. They travel through the political calculations of every single government on Earth that has, for the last 40 years, depended on Beijing for cheap trade, for massive investment, and most importantly, for the quiet, predictable stability that the entire global economy has been borrowing against. Something is breaking, and before this is over, you, me, and the entire world are going to feel it. Let and oppose. Start with the most visceral evidence. Let and oppose. Start with the fires. And to be clear, I am not talking about metaphorical fires of economic ruin. I am talking about real, physical, raging infernos. The kind of fires that consume ancient forests, strip hillsides bare, swallow entire villages, and leave behind a silence so total, so absolute, that it feels like the land itself has stopped breathing. Over the last few seasons, China has been battling wildfires at a scale and a frequency that its emergency management systems were simply not designed to handle. We are talking about provinces that have historically been considered incredibly low risk for this sort of thing. Millions of people are now watching literal walls of flame move across terrain that has not burned in living memory. Now, if you live in California or maybe Southern Europe, Spain, Greece, Italy, you might be thinking, and quote, well, wildfires are everywhere now. That and oppose. Just climate change. And quote, and you wouldn't and oppose. Be entirely wrong. But here is what makes the Chinese situation fundamentally different. The satellite imagery tells a story that the state media apparatus in Beijing has been incredibly careful not to broadcast too loudly. The smoke columns are visible from space. The thermal signatures are lighting up monitoring systems in universities and research centers far outside the reach of China and Oppo's Great Firewall. But these fires are not happening in a vacuum. They are not just an unfortunate natural disaster story. They are happening right on top of something else. Something that was already deeply fragile. Something that the Chinese government has spent years and billions of dollars trying to manage and years trying to hide. The system is now being stressed from multiple directions at the exact same time. To really grasp what this fragility is, we need to take a quick step back in time. We Don and Oppo's have to go back to ancient dynasties. We just need to go back far enough to understand the architecture of the modern Chinese machine. For most of the last 40 years, ever since the era of Deng Xiaoping, China operated on a single, brutally effective, dominant logic. It was simple: grow, build, expand. The strategy was to take incredibly cheap labor, massive tracts of cheap land, and endless cheap capital, convert all of that into manufactured goods, and ship those goods to every single corner of the globe. From the toys your kids play with, to the television on your wall, to the pharmaceutical ingredients in your medicine cabinet. The plan was brilliant in its execution. They used the resulting astronomical wealth to modernize the country at a breakneck pace. They used that modernization to legitimize the rule of the Communist Party. And they used that legitimacy to maintain absolute control. And let's be honest, for a very long time it worked. It worked spectacularly well. We are talking about the greatest single reduction in human poverty in the history of our species. Cities like Shenzhen literally rose from muddy rice paddies to become futuristic global tech hubs inside of a single generation. They built high-speed rail networks, bridges, and infrastructure that made Western civil engineers travel to China just to take photographs and marvel at the scale. But as anyone in Europe or America who has lived through the Industrial Revolution knows, every system has a price. And China has been paying its price on a credit card. Now, the bill is coming due and it is becoming fully visible. The first price is environmental. China essentially became the factory of the world by burning coal on a scale that no civilization in human history had ever dared to attempt. They traded clean air for GDP growth. The air quality in major industrial cities reached levels that respiratory doctors quietly compared to living your entire life inside a lit cigarette. The rivers turned colors that water is simply not supposed to turn, neon hues of chemical runoff. The soil across vast agricultural plains absorbed decades of unchecked industrial waste. And the forests? The vast, ancient, deep-rooted forests that once covered enormous portions of the Chinese interior were aggressively reduced. They were fragmented by rapid development, weakened by pollution, and left utterly vulnerable to exactly the kind of catastrophic fire conditions that are now arriving with terrifying clockwork regularity. But the price ISN and Oppo's just ecological. The second price is economic. And for those of us sitting in the West, feeling the pinch of inflation and crazy housing markets, this is going to sound eerily familiar, but multiplied by a factor of 10. The debt-fueled, export-heavy growth model that powered China and Oppo's rise has essentially slammed into a brick wall. The demographics are turning viciously against them. We will get into that demographic nightmare in a moment. But right now, the debt accumulated by local provincial governments and colossal property developers has reached levels that no official in Beijing will ever state publicly. Yet, every serious macroeconomist in London or Wall Street can calculate. You all remember the 2008 financial crash, right? When the US housing market went toxic and dragged the whole world down. Well, the Chinese property sector at its absolute peak accounted for something approaching a third of China and Oppo's entire economic output, nearly 30%. And right now, that sector is not recovering. It is restructuring. Companies like Evergrande and Country Garden, behemoths that built entire ghost cities, are drowning in liabilities. And here is the human tragedy of it. Restructuring at that massive scale in a country with that many ordinary citizens whose entire life savings are tied up in apartments they bought off-plan. apartments from developers who have now run out of money and can no longer deliver the actual homes. That is not a quiet process. It breeds a deep, simmering desperation. And that brings us to the third price, the political price. Over the last decade, Xi Jinping has consolidated power in a way that no Chinese leader since Mao Zedong has managed. On paper, that consolidation solved certain bureaucratic inefficiencies. But in reality, it created a massive, fatal flaw in the system. When power is that heavily concentrated at the very top, bad news travels incredibly slowly upward. Local officials out in the provinces quickly learn that the absolute safest strategy for their careers, and sometimes for their freedom, is to just report exactly what Beijing wants to hear. And quote, the quotas are met, the fires are contained, the economy is booming, end quote. And when the reports reaching the central government are systematically, artificially optimistic, the decisions flowing back down from the top are systematically wrong. They are governing based on a fiction. So you have these three compounding prices: a ruined environment, a stalling, debt-burdened economy, and a rigid, truth-averse political system. They have been building up for years. And today, the literal wildfires are burning right on top of all three of them at once. Here is where this story takes a very dark turn, moving from a localized disaster to a potential global catastrophe. The regions most severely affected by this current wildfire crisis are not empty, uninhabited patches of wilderness. We aren't and Apos, talking about remote Siberia. These are provinces with populations in the tens of millions. They are provinces that contain the vital agricultural land that China absolutely depends on to feed its own people. They sit upstream from massive river systems that carry fresh water to hundreds of millions of citizens downstream. And, in a twist of cruel irony that is definitely not a coincidence, these are the exact same provinces where economic stress has already been boiling over for years. Think about the chain reaction. When fire burns through agricultural land, the soil is sterilized. The harvest does not come. When the harvest fails, food prices move. Now, anyone who has been to a grocery store in Europe or America lately knows how frustrating food inflation is. But when food prices spike in a country of 1.4 billion people, the social math becomes incredibly uncomfortable incredibly quickly. China actually imports a massive amount of its food, far more than most people realize. But they also have a government that is acutely, almost obsessively aware of what food insecurity does to political stability. If you read Chinese history, the famines of the 20th century, the Great Leap Forward, these are not ancient history in the halls of Beijing. They are lived, institutional memory. They are the exact reason why food security is treated not as an economic issue, but as a top-tier national security issue. And right now, this wildfire crisis is intersecting with a broader agricultural nightmare that was already keeping officials awake before the first match was even struck this season. Rainfall patterns across massive parts of China have been wildly abnormal. Idan and Apos mean unusual in a minor, statistical sense. I mean genuinely anomalous in a geological sense. River levels in some key regions have been tracking at historic, devastating lows. Underneath the ground, the water tables in the agricultural heartland have been rapidly declining for decades. Intensive, desperate farming drew down ancient aquifer reserves that literally took thousands of years to accumulate. So, the dry, brittle soil moisture conditions that make these wildfires catastrophic rather than manageable, those are the exact same conditions that make total crop failures highly likely. This is not bad luck. This is climate physics. And here is the hard truth. China, for all its miraculous engineering power, for all its ability to build high-speed rail lines overnight, cannot build its way out of climate physics. Nature does not care about 5-year plans. What the government can do, and what it has been desperately trying to do, is manage the narrative. They are trying to control the information environment. They want to keep the true scale of the problem from becoming the kind of story that spreads panic and undermines public confidence in the Communist Party and Apos' divine right to govern. But what most censors fail to realize is that controlling the narrative about a raging wildfire is fundamentally harder than controlling the narrative about almost anything else. You can censor a banking protest. You can censor a dissenting journalist. But fires? Fires are visible from the ground, from the sky, from space. The people living next to these infernos do not need state media to tell them that everything is fine when they can literally smell the ash in their living rooms. They don an Oppos. Need a news anchor when they can look up and see an apocalyptic orange sky at noon. They can watch the frantic evacuation orders pinging on their phones, and they understand, without any political commentator explaining it to them, that something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong with the grand official plan. And that is exactly when the videos started appearing. Not on the heavily monitored Chinese platforms like Weibo or WeChat, those are scrubbed too fast. The footage started appearing on platforms outside the Great Firewall. It was posted by diaspora communities in London, Vancouver, and San Francisco. It was uploaded by travelers and citizens who used VPNs, finding clever, desperate ways to smuggle images across the multi-billion-dollar digital border that Beijing constructed to keep reality out. These videos showed the world what the official channels would not. They showed the terrifying scale of the burn areas. They showed the suffocating density of the smoke. They showed the exhausted, terrified faces of evacuees, carrying whatever meager possessions they could strap to their backs, leaving behind the lives they had built. They showed the panicked expressions of local officials, sweating in their suits, desperately trying to project calm while standing in front of horizons that were literally consumed by fire. Why does this matter so much? Why is a video of a fire a threat to a superpower? Because China and Oppo's social contract, the fundamental unspoken agreement between the Communist Party and the Chinese people, is built on one very specific promise. And for Westerners, this is sometimes hard to wrap our heads around. The promise the party makes to the people is not democracy. It is not freedom of speech. It is not the right to protest, to organize labor unions, or to vote in a ballot box. The promise is competence. The party's entire claim to absolute legitimacy rests entirely on its ability to deliver results, to manage crises, to protect the population from the kinds of disasters, both natural and economic, that weaker, messier democratic governments would supposedly fail to prevent. They trade freedom for security and prosperity. So, when raw, unfiltered video footage shows something that looks undeniably like a crisis being managed badly, or worse, not being managed at all, that is not a PR headache. That is an existential challenge to the very foundation of the entire political arrangement. If the party is no longer competent, why should the people surrender their freedoms? Now, I want you to take that volatile mix of environmental disaster and fractured trust, and I want you to layer in the economic dimension we touched on earlier. The picture becomes incredibly dark. I want to be precise here. China and Oppo's economy is not in freefall. Let and Oppo's dispel that myth. Anyone who tells you that China is collapsing tomorrow is selling you a book or oversimplifying a wildly complex reality. China and Oppo's economy is enormous. It is diversified in ways that make a sudden Soviet-style collapse highly unlikely. It is backed by a state that has fiscal tools at its disposal that no Western government could ever dream of using legally. But China and Oppo's economy is under severe, grinding stress in ways that matter enormously for what happens over the next decade. That property crisis we talked about, the one centered on mega developers like Evergrande, it didn't end Oppo's magically resolve. It was, in the words of economists, and quote, managed downward, end quote. And there is a massive difference. Managing a crisis downward means the government steps in to prevent a sudden, chaotic collapse. But in doing so, they allow for a slow, agonizing, grinding deflation. A deflation of property values, of consumer confidence, and most importantly, of the, end quote, wealth effect, end quote. For decades, real estate was a one-way bet in China. It made hundreds of millions of Chinese families feel wealthy, secure, and invested in the future. Now, that illusion is evaporating. When families feel less secure, what do? Exactly what you or I would do. They stop spending. They hoard cash. And when they spend less, domestic consumption tanks. Beijing has been desperately trying to grow its domestic consumer market to replace its old export-driven model, but a terrified population won and Oppo's buy new cars or designer clothes. And domestic consumption can and Oppo's Fill the gap just as export markets are being squeezed tight. We are seeing tariff wars, geopolitical tensions, and Western governments in Europe and the US suddenly deciding that being utterly dependent on Chinese manufacturing for critical tech and medicine is a massive strategic vulnerability. They are, end quote, de-risking, end quote. Factories are moving to Vietnam, Mexico, and India. So, the economic growth numbers are starting to look very, very different from the rosy targets outlined in the party and Oppo's 5-year plan. Which brings us to one of the most shocking statistics of the modern era. Last year, youth unemployment in China hit levels that were so terrifying, so deeply alarming, that the Chinese government did something unprecedented. They just stopped publishing the data. Think about that for a second. Let that sink in. A superpower government that publishes meticulous, boastful statistics about absolutely everything. A state that has built the most massive apparatus of economic measurement and surveillance in human history, decided that one single number was simply too dangerous to share with its own people. That number was the unemployment rate for young people between the ages of 16 and 24. The very last figure they released, right before the data blackout, was hovering above 21%. More than 1 in 5 young people out of work. And independent economic estimates suggest the real, unvarnished figure was significantly higher, perhaps approaching 30% in some areas. We are talking about a generation of young Chinese people who are the most educated in the country and Oppo's history. They have degrees their parents could not have even hallucinated. And they are entering a brutal job market that simply cannot absorb them. They are living in sprawling megacities where the cost of housing remains impossibly, astronomically high, even as the broader economy cools down. They are unable to form households. They are unable to start families. They are completely unable to access the glittering version of the, in quote, Chinese dream, in quote, that was relentlessly sold to them on every billboard and TV screen throughout their entire childhoods. In the West, we talk about millennials and Gen Z being locked out of the housing market. Imagine that frustration, but in a society where you aren't and Oppo's even allowed to complain about it online. This is the deeply human, deeply fractured background against which these wildfires are burning. But what is happening right now changes the calculus completely. Because the fires, the economic stagnation, the youth unemployment, and the property rot, they are not operating in isolation. There is a deeper, massive structural tectonic plate shifting underneath all of this, a pressure that most international news coverage consistently fails to emphasize. China is getting old, and they are getting old incredibly fast. We are finally seeing the catastrophic demographic consequences of the one-child policy. That policy ran for decades, and while it achieved its goal of curbing population growth, it created a scenario that demographers refer to as a severe population pyramid distortion. The bill for playing God with demographics has arrived. The working-age population in China is now actively shrinking. Meanwhile, the elderly, retired population is exploding. The number of young, tax-paying workers available to support each aging retiree is declining toward ratios that make the basic arithmetic of pensions genuinely terrifying. Now, Japan went through a version of this demographic cliff in the 1990s. It resulted in what economists call the, end quote, lost decades, end quote, of stagnant growth. But here is the critical difference. Japan grew rich before it grew old. Japan is a wealthy, highly stable, technologically advanced democracy. They have strong, transparent institutions and a robust social safety net built over generations. China is attempting to navigate this exact same demographic cliff, but they are doing it before they have fully developed their social wealth. They are trying to survive this demographic winter while simultaneously juggling a collapsing property market, an alienated youth, an environmental emergency, massive geopolitical isolation from the West, and a rigid political system that has literally ripped out the internal feedback mechanisms needed to course correct. And now, add the wildfires back into this volatile mix. We aren't and Oppo's just talking about the immediate tragedy of the flames. We are talking about the long-term, generational damage. The loss of vital forest cover that took centuries to grow and will take centuries to recover. The massive soil erosion that inevitably follows when fire strips vegetation from steep mountain terrain. The permanent watershed damage that heavily reduces the reliability of fresh water supplies in regions that are already parched. The massive disruption to agriculture that compounds the exact food security terrors Beijing is tracking so closely. I want to be clear here. The Chinese government is not stupid. They are not unaware of this. It would be a fatal mistake for anyone in Washington, London, or Brussels to assume that the people running the most sophisticated authoritarian state on the planet cannot see the data. They see the problems. The question is not whether they recognize the crisis. The fundamental question is whether the system they have built is actually capable of responding to problems of this immense scale, complexity, and sheer speed. Authoritarian systems are brilliant at mobilization. But navigating deeply interwoven, systemic crises requires open flows of information. It requires distributed, localized decision-making. It requires public accountability to point out when a policy is failing. And those are the exact mechanisms that the Chinese system has spent the last decade aggressively suppressing. History has a lot to say about this dynamic. If you look back, large, seemingly invincible states have collapsed before. And it doesn't end oppose. T always happens slowly. Udon and oppose. T always get a 10-year warning. Sometimes the pristine appearance of absolute strength and the hidden reality of absolute fragility coexist for a very, very long time. Right up until the exact moment they dawn and oppose. T. The Soviet Union looked like a permanent, immovable monolith for decades. Until one day, it wasn't and oppose. T. The Ottoman Empire seemed like an eternal fixture of the globe. Until it wasn't and oppose. T. Again, I am not sitting here predicting the imminent collapse of the Chinese state. But these historical examples are stark reminders that the gap between a government and oppose's official, mandated narrative and the actual, lived reality on the ground can stretch incredibly wide. And when that rubber band finally snaps, when the moment of reckoning arrives and that gap closes, it can happen with a speed that catches the entire world off guard. If you ask the top leaders in Beijing what they fear most, they wouldn't and oppose. T say a foreign invasion. They wouldn't and oppose. T say the US Navy or a conflict over Taiwan. What truly keeps the vast Chinese security apparatus awake in cold sweats at 3 in the morning is the terrifying possibility of internal fracture. They fear provinces that just stop listening to central commands. They fear a massive population that finally stops believing in the grand promise of competence. They fear a black swan crisis or a rapid sequence of crises that moves faster than their centralized bureaucracy can process and respond. The wildfires we are seeing, they are just one single thread in this larger, fraying fabric. But all these threads are deeply connected. And when enough of them are pulled in the exact same direction at the exact same time, even the strongest Kevlar fabric will eventually tear. Now, let's bring this home to why you and I should care. The international dimension of this story gets criminally little attention. China is not just some isolated nation experiencing a tough run of domestic luck. China is the central, beating heart of a global economic network that billions of people, including everyone listening to this podcast, depend on every single day. We rely on them in ways we won and oppose. T fully appreciate until the machine stops working. The affordable goods that line the shelves of your local supermarket. The microcomponents inside the laptop or smartphone you are using to stream my voice right now. The rare earth minerals that are packed inside the batteries of the electric vehicles that every Western government agrees are essential for our green energy transition. The vast, labyrinthine shipping lanes and container logistics networks that physically move the modern world from point A to point B. Almost all of it runs directly through China. Any significant, unmanaged disruption to Chinese industrial output, to their logistics capacity, or to their financial stability would and oppose. T just be a Chinese problem. It would send massive, violent shockwaves through the global economy. You would feel it in the stock markets in London, the grocery aisles in Chicago, the manufacturing plants in Stuttgart, and the ports of Sao Paulo. This is exactly why Western governments watch Beijing not just with a sense of strategic competition, but with something far closer to anxious, terrified dependency. The West needs China to stay functional. We need the supply chains to keep humming. We need the factory of the world to keep the lights on and the machines running. And what is unfolding inside China right now, this perfect storm of environmental decay, economic stagnation, demographic implosion, and political rigidity, is precisely the kind of ultimate stress test that those global supply chains have never, ever faced at this scale. We got a tiny preview of this during the recent tariff wars and the pandemic. When trade flows were disrupted, massive multinational companies panicked. They suddenly realized that supply chains optimized purely for cheap, maximum efficiency were incredibly fragile. Prices skyrocketed. Bizarre shortages appeared. One week you couldn't and oppose. Buy a microchip, the next week you couldn't and oppose. Find building materials. Boardrooms in Europe and America that had never given a second thought to geopolitics were suddenly scrambling to hire intelligence analysts. But that was a managed disruption. It was a trade war, negotiated by politicians who, at the end of the day, didn't and oppose. Actually want a full economic divorce. What nobody in the West has fully stress-tested is what happens if the disruption comes not from a calculated policy decision in Washington or Beijing, but from a genuine, uncontrollable internal crisis within China itself. What happens if the factory catches fire and no one can put it out? Which brings me to a piece of this puzzle that is flying completely under the radar. It and oppose S about water. The wildfire crisis is colliding with something the Chinese government has been trying to engineer its way out of for decades: the distribution of fresh water. You see, water in China is not located where the people and the factories are. The north of China, where you find the massive megacities and the heavy industrial capacity, is chronically, desperately short of water. The south historically has plenty of water. But right now, the south is burning. The fires are sweeping through the very forests and hillsides that act as the natural sponges regulating the watersheds that feed the mighty rivers. To solve their geography problem, China built the South-to-North Water Transfer Project. It is arguably one of the most astonishing, massive civil engineering feats in human history, literally moving rivers across a continent. But here is the flaw. You build that infrastructure based on historical assumptions of how much water the South will have to give. When climate change and wildfires alter those assumptions, your multi-billion-dollar infrastructure becomes useless. The fires are fundamentally altering the water cycle. When a forest burns, the soil becomes hydrophobic. It physically repels water instead of absorbing it. So when the rains finally do come, the water doesn't and oppose. Filter gently into the ground to replenish the aquifers. It rushes off the bare hillsides in catastrophic, destructive flash floods. So the fires create two massive nightmares simultaneously: extreme drought during the dry season and deadly flooding when the rains arrive. Both require astronomical amounts of government money to manage. Both devastate crop yields. And both of these disasters are arriving right at the exact moment when local provincial governments are totally broke. Remember the property crash? For decades, local governments funded their budgets by selling land to developers. Now that the developers are bankrupt, the land sales have stopped. The revenue has evaporated. So you have less money coming in, and massive emergency spending required to fight fires and floods going out. It is a fiscal death spiral. And this is what you won and oppose. See on the evening news. But underneath the macroeconomic data, the supply chain theories, and the geopolitical chess moves, there is a profound human story. We cannot allow systems analysis to obscure the humanity of what is happening. Hundreds of millions of ordinary Chinese citizens are living through this intersection of crises. They are in and oppose, experiencing it as data points on a graph. They are experiencing it as the terrifying texture of their daily lives. It is the farmer standing at the edge of his property, watching a wall of smoke move toward the fields that represent his family and oppose's entire livelihood. It is the brilliant young university graduate, sitting in a cramped apartment, sending out her 200th job application and receiving nothing but absolute silence in return. It is the middle-class family in a second-tier city, staring at a half-finished concrete apartment building, realizing that the life savings they handed over to a developer are gone, and the home they were promised will never be built. These people are not mindless drones. They are not powerless. They are incredibly creative, deeply resilient, hardworking people who are acutely aware when their government is lying to them. Throughout history, the Chinese people have proven time and time again that there is a strict limit to how long a massive gap between the official state narrative and their lived, painful reality can be maintained before it triggers profound consequences. The Communist Party knows this better than anyone. It is the reason the censorship apparatus exists. It is why the social credit system was deployed. It is why the surveillance cameras are on every corner. They know that information is power. And they know that distributed, shared information in the hands of a population that is experiencing genuine, shared suffering is the most destabilizing force on Earth. But here is the ultimate failing of the most sophisticated censorship machine ever built. It has physical limits. You cannot censor the sky over a city when it turns the color of a bruised orange. You cannot delete the frantic text message from a cousin in the next province begging you to evacuate. You cannot scrub the reality of a bank account that shows a number radically smaller than it did yesterday. You cannot algorithmically hide the reality of a job that simply doesn't and oppose. T exist no matter how many years you studied. Some information doesn't and oppose. T need the internet to travel. Travels through shared misery. It travels through people. And in a country of 1.4 billion people, that vast organic network of direct human experience is a force of nature that no government, no matter how totalitarian, can ever fully control. So, where does this leave us? What comes next? The Chinese government will react. They always do. They possess resources, organizational capacity, and a sheer ruthlessness in executing massive interventions that no democratic government on Earth could ever dream of replicating. We should never underestimate their power to mandate action. When Beijing decrees that a mountain must be moved, the mountain moves. But the fundamental nature of what China is facing today is radically different from the challenges that top-down organizational power is actually good at solving. If a pandemic hits and you need to build a massive quarantine hospital in 10 days, that is a logistics problem. Authoritarian systems excel at logistics. But reversing a demographic death spiral that has been baked into the population for 40 years? That is not a logistics problem. You cannot mandate a baby boom with concrete and steel. Restoring the shattered economic confidence of an entire generation of young people who have looked at the system and decided to, and quote, lie flat and quote, because the game is rigged? That is not a logistics problem. Reversing decades of ecological devastation, resurrecting burned ancient forests, and refilling depleted ancient aquifers? That is not a logistics problem. And most critically, rebuilding the trust of a vast population that has watched critical economic data simply vanish the moment it became inconvenient for the party. That is definitely not a logistics problem. These are deep, systemic, structural diseases. They require systemic cures. And administering systemic cures in a political environment that has deliberately, methodically executed anyone who provides organic, bottom-up feedback or criticism is an extraordinarily difficult, perhaps impossible task. So, the fire is still burning. And I mean that literally and metaphorically. It is burning in the forests. It is burning in the hollowed-out property market. It is burning in the skewed demographics. It is burning in the widening, dangerous void between what the state broadcaster says and what the citizens see with their own eyes. And it is burning in the quiet, anxious boardrooms of every Western nation that foolishly tied its supply chains and its strategic future to the blind assumption that China would just keep growing, stably and predictably, forever. The question that the most serious geopolitical analysts are asking today is no longer, and quote, will China face a crisis? And quote, that question is over. It has been answered by the smoke in the air and the missing data. The real question now is whether the rigid, unyielding structure of the Chinese system has the shock absorbers to take these massive, simultaneous hits without something fundamental, something foundational breaking apart. Will the absolute centralization of power prove to be their saving grace in a moment of panic? Or will it prove to be their fatal brittleness? Will the suppression of bad news protect public morale? Or will it ensure that the men at the top steer the ship directly into the iceberg because no one was brave enough to tell them to turn? As we and Oppos V discussed, history is not kind to highly centralized, highly surveilled empires facing multi-front systemic stress. China could be the exception. They have defied gravity before. But anyone who sits in front of a microphone and tells you they know exactly how this ends is lying to you. Here is what we actually know. We know something is fracturing. We know the speed of that fracture is accelerating. We know the number of pressure points is increasing. And we know that when the true ripple effects finally wash over our international markets, our logistics networks, and the geopolitical balance of the globe, the impact will be far more violent and consequential than the current, distracted level of media attention would have you believe. Eventually, the physical wildfires will burn themselves out, or they will be extinguished. But the flames are just the prelude. The real story begins when you examine what the burned, blackened land reveals underneath. I want you to watch very closely what happens when the smoke clears, because here is the final, undeniable truth that ties all of this together. The rise of China was, without debate, the single defining human story of the last 50 years. It fundamentally rewired the global economy. It pulled more human beings out of crushing poverty than any other event in recorded history. It built the future at a speed that left the West dizzy. That story is not over. As I said, China is not vanishing into the ocean, but it is transforming. And that transformation is going to be incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly disorderly, and deeply, historically consequential for every single one of us who shares this planet with them. The wildfires burning across those provinces today are not metaphors for Western pundits to play with. They are real fires destroying real lives and wiping out real futures. But they are the ultimate symptom of an environment pushed fatally past its limits. They are the symptom of a hyper-extractive economic model that burned too hot, too fast. And they are the symptom of a political machine that chose total control over true resilience, and is only just now discovering the catastrophic price of that trade. So, as we wrap up today, my advice to you is this: pay attention. Do not pay attention to the polished official statements coming out of diplomatic press briefings. Do not pay attention to the reassuring manufactured GDP graphs. Do not pay attention to the numbers that are still allowed to be published, while the terrifying ones are erased from the internet. Pay attention to the sky over the cities. Pay attention to the exhausted faces of the people packing their bags. Pay attention to the massive, deafening silence in the exact places where the data used to be. That silence is screaming at you. Listen to it carefully, because that silence is where the real story of the 21st century is just beginning. Thank you all for sticking with me through this one. It and Oppos. It's a heavy topic, but it and Oppos. S one we absolutely have to face with clear eyes. If this episode made you think, if it gave you a perspective you aren't and Oppos, getting from the evening news, please hit subscribe. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many as I can. We will be back later this week with more deep dives, more analysis, and yes, maybe a little bit of the usual daily gossip to lighten the mood. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and take care of each other. See you next time.